which I'm happy to say spent 10 weeks on the New York Times bestseller list earlier this year. However, the New York Times has, thanks. Thank you very much. New York Times, though, has refused to review it. However, they'll still impose Paul Krugman on us every week. That we're not going to be spared. That every week we're definitely going to get him. But no dissent is allowed in the New York Times. But on the other hand, I think we all know about the financial picture the New York Times is facing. So I tend to think it doesn't want to promote a book that argues against bailouts, given what the media is obviously going to be demanding in the near future. Well, let's not talk about that particular depressing subject. And in fact, I hope I'm not going to depress you today, because I am going to leave you with the suggestion that there is a way out of this. Now, whether or not they're going to follow it is another question. But it's comforting to know that if we wanted to get out of this economic mess, we could do it. It's not impossible. It can be done. Now, I'm not going to talk about some of the things that you would likely encounter if you turned on right-wing radio, where you'd hear a lot of denunciation of the Community Reinvestment Act that introduced affirmative action in lending, or Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac, whose irresponsible decisions were, I think, a fairly significant factor in all this. But all the same, there is nevertheless the elephant in the living room, the factor that more than any other contributed to the crisis, but yet that never gets mentioned, is never mentioned in a negative light, certainly in political circles, where, in fact, to the contrary, we're in effect encouraged not even to think about it, and that's the Federal Reserve System. Now, most Americans hear Federal Reserve System and they think, I don't even know what this is. I'm never going to know. This is probably too complicated, and I better just let the experts take care of this. Well, that's the problem. The experts are a bunch of quacks. So it's important for us to learn this material, to know what's going on, so that we can have an informed opinion, so that we won't inadvertently enlist in the army of drones who say that the solution to the crisis is to give more power to our wise overlords. Been there, done that. The Federal Reserve System is, in effect, in charge of the country's money supply, as I'm sure I don't need to tell people in this room. It has the ability to increase or decrease it. I think we all know the direction it normally goes. It is supposed to act as a lender of last resort for the financial sector. Well, there's one thing it knows how to do, right? We've seen that. That's no problem. They got that pretty well under control. And we're told that the Fed is a great stabilizing agent in the economy. So really, we shouldn't really be questioning it, because the Fed brings scientific management to bear on our money supply. I mean, who could question that? What kind of crank are you, after all? You know, this is for our own good. Even the left, which prides itself on its slogan, question authority, falls completely silent when it comes to the Fed. If you question the Fed, well, that's taking question authority just a little bit too far. Well, I intend to do that. I think those of us in this room are inclined not just to accept whatever we're fed by the establishment, especially when the establishment has been obviously so wrong. So we're inclined to ask fundamental questions that are normally passed over. So, for example, normally what happens when there's an economic crisis of this kind is that we get people on one side saying we need fiscal stimulus. We've got to just blow a lot of borrowed money on nonsense projects, and that'll make us rich. And then the other side is supposed to say, oh, no, let's just print up a lot of money and spend it on such and such. And that's the big debate. That's the debate. But yet we are introducing into this debate a third possibility, which is that the first two are completely juvenile and are only going to make the situation worse. Now, what I'm going to be talking to you about today, though, involves something called the Austrian School of Economics. This has nothing to do with Austria per se, other than a lot of the early figures in the school came from Austria. Now, this is important because right now the Austrian school, which is a school of economic thought, is the smallest probably in the world. It also happens to be the oldest continuously existing school of thought in the world, and right now it's the fastest growing. Why? Because disproportionately, economists of the Austrian school predicted what we're seeing at a time when the rest of the profession was completely blindsided. James Galbraith estimates that maybe 1/10 or 1/100% of professional economists saw this crisis coming. Now, naturally, he's not including the Austrian economists, because that's the job of James Galbraith, to pretend there are no Austrian economists. But we need to We need to highlight these people because they did see what's coming, and that's why people are interested in them. Meanwhile, the mainstream, so-called, of the economics profession has, in my opinion, completely disgraced itself during this crisis. Not only because it failed to see it coming, not only because they told us this is the most robust economy anyone's ever seen, they said that in 2007, but also because the solutions, so-called solutions they propose, as I say, are utterly juvenile and extremely crude. And this is all they have to show for themselves. Now, the mainstream of the economics profession has, in effect, morphed from what was once a small, cultish corner of the profession, namely a group of people who thought that the best thing for economics to do was to ape physics. So I think a lot of times in economics we have former or would-be physicists who, for whatever reason, couldn't get through a physics program, and so the next best thing is become an economist and try and ape the methods of the physical sciences. And so you come up with absurd models that apply only to an economy on Mars, or that apply to an economy in long-run equilibrium that we're never going to reach, but never actually talk about the actual economy we're living in. And so if you actually read the American Economic Review, you'll find it's completely unreadable. It's all math, it's all jargon, and you would not be alone if you're not subscribing to the American Economic Review. You're not alone. They did a study not long ago to ask how many people read the average article in the American Economic Review. And the answer was 2.5. 2.5 people reading the typical article. Now, I assume they're not including the editor and the author, because then we'd be left with like a half a guy running around reading articles. So the fact that the mainstream is not favorable toward the Austrian School of Economics, I don't count as a demerit. I count that as a point in its favor. I don't see that the mainstream of the profession has exactly been doing a bang-up job recently. Well, what I want to talk about today is as follows. I want to explain first the precipitating factor in what happened to us, and no, it's not deregulation, it's not the free market is evil, it's not all the nonsense you get from CNBC or from the White House or whatever. All of that stuff is false. Everybody who says the free market has failed and so, the drones who run the economy need more power is just dead wrong. So first, what was the precipitating factor? Secondly, I want to explain why fiscal stimulus is a juvenile idea, why it only intensifies the problem, likewise for monetary stimulus, and then propose what actually could be done to accelerate the recovery. And here I'm going to make reference to an episode in American history no one's ever heard of, a depression that was over in about 1.5 years because the government did the exact opposite of what it's doing right now. So first to the Fed. Now, the Fed has nothing, in my opinion, whatsoever to do with the free market. The free market is the idea of social cooperation bounded by private property rights, that we all engage in voluntary transactions with each other, and we cannot trespass upon other people's rights to life and property. That's all it is. For all the boogeyman definitions you've been given about the wickedness of the free market, that's all it is. There's no room in that setup for a monopoly paper money producer. That violates the tenets of the free market, which opposes monopolies, and the free market would never produce a paper money system like we have now, where the money is just paper, it's not redeemable into anything. The system we have now has never been created voluntarily through the free market. Never. No such thing. It has always been introduced through government and through threats of violence and with the use of the police to suppress alternatives. It has never spontaneously emerged. So the Fed, therefore, is going to be the target of my remarks. Now, I am of the opinion the free market more or less works in every situation. And so I don't make an exception to say that, yeah, the free market works. However, when it comes to money and interest rates, there we need a Soviet commissar engaging in a central plan. I don't see, it seems like an inconsistency. I don't see any need to concede this. And yet, the chairman of the Federal Reserve System, from the late 80s up till just a few years ago, Alan Greenspan, was treated like a god among men in our financial press and in popular culture and television. He was called the maestro. The New York Times, in its typical toadying totalitarian fashion, referred to Greenspan as the infallible maestro of our financial system. Bob Woodward, the reporter for the Washington Post, you know, supposedly the big anti-establishment reporter, right? Bob Woodward said that in The Wizard of Oz, now see, right away we're off to a creepy start. He says, in The Wizard of Oz, when the man behind the curtain is revealed, we are disappointed. But in Greenspan, we find comfort. Just creepy, right? Totally creepy. I mean, this is beneath the dignity of a free people, for heaven's sake. Or my favorite example is from the New Republic magazine, which I hope none of you waste your time reading. But the New Republic had a journalist who had a little bit of a problem in the 1990s. He used to just make up his stories, just make them up. And other journalists would be wondering, man, why didn't I get that story? Well, because it came out of this guy's brain. It didn't actually occur. And one of the stories that this guy wrote, Stephen Glass, was about Alan Greenspan. And he told the story that a group of Wall Street executives had built a little shrine to Greenspan with his image and some flowers and candles, and they would meet there and meditate in front of it. Now, what's more amazing than that somebody would invent a story like that is that nobody noticed that was a phony story. People thought, yeah, that seems like a reasonable thing somebody might do, sure. Something's wrong here. This doesn't make sense in a free society, so I want to puncture some of this bizarre aura that surrounds both this man in particular and the Federal Reserve he headed in general. Now let's talk about a Nobel Prize winner in economics who actually deserved the prize, unlike certain people whose names we won't mention until later today. And that's F.A. Hayek. Now Hayek won the Nobel Prize for showing that central banks like the Fed, monopoly central banks created by government, and that would be absolutely nothing without the government-granted monopoly privileges they have, destabilize the economy. Forget all this mythology about what wonderful stabilizing agents they are. To the contrary, since we've had the Fed, when you compare the number of panics and crises we've had, it has doubled since that time. So don't give me the, it's a wonderful stabilizer. That's a whole lot of propaganda. Hayek, it's significant that he wins the Nobel Prize because Hayek is saying the exact opposite of what the Nobel Committee would want to hear. They don't want to hear that the whole central banking thing is a big racket that destabilizes rather than stabilizes the economy. So it's very significant he wins at all because he's saying the exact opposite of what they would like to hear. Now, anybody can understand Hayek's argument. Well, again, with the exception of certain recent Nobel Prize winners. But anybody in this room, anybody watching on television, anybody can understand this. And if you really want to understand what happened to the economy and why it is completely, even laughably bogus to blame this on the free market, I suggest just this 2 minutes, you'll find, hey, wait a minute, this makes a lot of sense. In fact, I'm happy to say I spoke at the University of Colorado at Boulder a few months ago. And I didn't realize it, dumb me, I didn't know until I got there what Boulder's reputation was. That, you know, they're kind of on the political left. I didn't know that. You know, they invited me to speak, so I'm going. And the room was full, I was happy to see, on a Friday night. So, I mean, I don't care what your political outlook is. If you're coming to an economics lecture on a Friday night, you get a pass from me. So these people were there, and a lot of them were Obama supporters, and I thought, I'm not getting out of here alive. But as it turns out, afterward, they thought, you know, hey, you made a good presentation. I got email later about this. You made a good presentation. You made us think, you know, we don't see what the argument against what you're saying is. I did a show with a left-wing host in advance of an appearance in West Virginia, Howard Monroe. Had 10 minutes to explain Hayek's theory. So it's not me. It's not like I'm some genius. I'm just explaining Hayek's theory. So in 10 minutes, he said, wow. He said, you know, I was expecting to hate you. Instead, you know, you make a good case. And then finally, the guy who reads the audio book of Meltdown. And this guy's got the greatest reading voice you can imagine. You know, it's like he's like that guy from the movies who just died, you know, in a world. You know, he's that kind of voice. He's an Obama supporter, too. And he said when he got Meltdown, he thought, oh, here we go, another bit of right-wing propaganda about the free market. And he wrote to me and said, I have to admit, you make a strong case. So it is nice once in a while that even though we have disagreements with people, we can be civil and we can listen to what we're saying. You know, isn't this a wonderful break from what usually takes place? Well, anyway, here's Hayek's argument, very, very simply. Hayek wants to know, why is it the economy moves like this? How come we're all doing great, then everybody's in the toilet, and then great, and then up and down? Why is this happening? I mean, this is, you know, kind of an interesting question, isn't it? Why is this happening? Why is there what the economist Lionel Robbins called a cluster of error, where all of a sudden people who had been great forecasters of consumer demand turn out to be terrible at it, all at the same time in the same direction? Like, why would this happen? This demands explanation. The market weeds out people who stink at anticipating consumer demand. Those people make losses and or go out of business. And people who are good at it expand and get more control over capital. So at any one time, the market is in fact promoting people who are the best at doing this. So why are these people selected by the market for their forecasting ability? Why are they all so bad at the same time? Good question. Very rarely do you get an answer to this question other than a psychological one, that, oh, well, you know, there are animal spirits that sometimes make them want to invest a lot, and then it turns around they don't want to invest so much, and whatever. I mean, what a totally anti-intellectual, unsatisfying explanation this is. Hayek says, no, there are real factors that account for why this occurs. And now Hayek focuses on interest rates. And if you're inclined to say, okay, interest rates, there's no way, this is too complicated, whatever, I'm telling you, interest rates are so important. I mean, you're going to have a dream tonight about a giant interest rate symbol chasing you around because you're going to realize the significance of this. What Hayek is saying is that, you know, interest rates are not just arbitrary numbers. You can't just change them and expect nothing to happen. I mean, we would all like to have low interest rates in the same way that we would all like to have milk sell for 5 cents a gallon. But we only want that if it occurs spontaneously. If the government makes milk 5 cents a gallon, that doesn't mean we're all going to get cheap milk. It means we're all going to get no milk. So we can't just simply say, anything that seems good for me as a consumer must be good and super, and let's have the government just force it. Well, you might as well ask the government to abolish the law of gravity, because that's in effect what you're trying to do. Interest rates mean something. They are where they are for a reason. And if you interfere with them, so notice interfering in the free market, if you interfere with them, you are going to lead to massive discoordination. Because what does the interest rate do? What function, what role does it play? It coordinates production across time, which is a fancy way of saying that when people are willing to postpone their purchases into the future, well, that's a time when it makes sense for businesses to engage in long-term projects that will bear fruit only in the relatively distant future. Whereas if people want to consume right now, this is not a time to deploy resources on product development for new products. So the interest rate coordinates demands of consumers for goods now versus goods in the future. And secondly, and this is really just the other side of the same coin, the interest rate makes sure there are enough resources, actual physical resources available in the economy to complete all the relatively long-term projects that businesses engage in. Well, when we save more, when you and I save more, and we restrict our consumption temporarily, this lowers the interest rate. We put our money in the banks. This pushes interest rates lower. The banks have more to lend, so to take a little shortcut here, the price of lending in effect goes down. Just common sense. Well, when we do that, that indicates, number one, we're postponing our desire to consume into the future. And number two, because we're postponing our desire to consume, we are also releasing resources into the economy for use by these longer-term projects. Because if we're not going to be producing as many immediate consumer goods, well, then some of the factors of production that go into producing consumer goods are now released and made available for longer-term projects, like research and development, or manufacturing, or mining, expanding mining capacity. Now, the reason that low interest rates encourage long-term investment should be obvious. The longer term your investment is, the more interest matters. If I've got to make a 10-year, start a 10-year project at 15% interest, well, it might just not even be worth my while. But if the interest rate comes down to 8%, it might be profitable for me to do it. So the longer term the investment is, the more it's going to be artificially stimulated if interest rates are interfered with. If interest rates come down naturally because there's more saving available, well, then it does make sense for a long-term investment to get started. The resources are available to do it. People are willing to wait the time it takes for these projects to mature. So the interest rate plays this crucial coordinating function. It's not the case that you can create a utopia by forcing interest rates down artificially and that all of a sudden, you know, it'll be all just sunshine and kittens everywhere. That is not the case. The interest rate is a genuine constraint that is there to limit our ambitions, to make clear to us we cannot do everything simultaneously. We cannot begin every conceivable production project at the same time. It limits this. So Hayek's point is this. Let's suppose interest rates come down naturally. Well, as we've seen, we have coordination, because we have long-term investments starting at a time when people have deferred consumption and released resources for use in longer-term projects, or we might call higher-order stages of production. But let's say you have a central bank like the Fed that has various means to push interest rates lower artificially. Well, what's the difference here? Well, here we have the same effect, which is that more long-term projects are undertaken. But notice the difference. In this case, people haven't stopped consuming or restricted their consumption. They're consuming just as much as before. If anything, they're consuming even more, thanks to the low interest rates discouraging them from saving. So now people are going to be consuming more and not releasing resources. So now these long-term projects, it's going to turn out they're not all going to be profitable, because literally there aren't enough resources to complete them. Because the resources that are supposed to be released from consumer goods production into the production of these more distant things haven't been released. So there isn't enough to go around. So the prices of these factors are going to go up. And that's going to seriously compromise the profitability of these new projects. So that, in a nutshell, is what Hayek is saying, is that you have a boom temporarily, people are building things. But what good is a boom if they're building things they can't ever finish? They're building things that don't correspond to what consumers want. That's what Hayek's argument is. If you interfere with the structure of interest rates as the market sets them, the result is massive error on the part of investors, businessmen, and consumers alike. This is the source of the cluster of error. Now, Ludwig von Mises was the great Austrian economist of the 20th century, died in 1973. Let me just point out that Mises had to flee Nazi-controlled Europe, where he had been teaching in Europe, teaching in Switzerland for a while, and he had to flee eventually, not only because he was Jewish, but also because what he was teaching was not exactly in conformity with the Nazi economic program. Mises was talking about the international division of labor and how the market is the best example of human cooperation across borders, and what a wondrous thing it is that somehow we can take resources from all over the place and without any central direction we can create wealth. And what an amazing, wonderful thing this is. Well, you know, it's not exactly what the autarkic Nazi party wants to hear. So they destroyed his papers and his library. He fled to the United States, where he arrived in 1940 in his late 50s, almost empty-handed, not speaking a word of English, and with no paid university position, at a time when every semi-competent, every boob, every Marxist could find some employment. There's Mises, one of the great economic geniuses of all time, and yet he went on to be as productive, if not more productive, than ever. His great treatise, Human Action, 1949, is a fantastic bestseller, even though it's 900 pages. Mises was an extraordinary genius whose work is now still being studied and remembered at a time when all those nobodies who were getting hired and welcomed over him have long since been forgotten. Well, Mises, after whom the institute I work for, the Ludwig von Mises Institute, is named, in Human Action gives a great analogy for what's happening in the economy when, in fact, you're playing havoc with interest rates. He says, let's imagine the entire economy as being a master builder, building a house, and he's got a supply of bricks that he thinks is larger than it actually is. And let's, for the sake of argument, say these are all the bricks in the whole economy. Well, it's better for him to discover this error earlier rather than later, because if he discovers it earlier, well, he's only squandered so many of them, and he's only wasted so much of his time. But if he discovers his error as he's putting on the last brick, well, this is a disaster. He's wasted an awful lot more labor time. This house, part of it may have to be demolished at this point, if not the whole thing. Whereas if he discovers the error sooner, well, he can go back to his blueprint, he can cross things off, change things around, make the best of the situation. But notice what would not help him. Notice what would not help this master builder if we simply got him drunk and said, hey, you know, keep on building. Well, yeah, then, hey, look, he'll be happy. It'll look like an economic boom, right? He's working, right? He's building. This is an economic boom, right? Well, is the house any more unbuildable, unfinishable than it was before, any less than it was before? Of course not. He still can't finish it. But now he's going to be misled into continuing even longer. Well, that's what happens to the economy every time people say the cure for low interest rate problems is even lower interest rates. Because in effect, you're saying to the economy, sure, you've started off on investment projects that can't possibly be completed. The physical resources don't exist to finish them. Keep doing that. How about start some more? That's what you're doing when you say we need more credit pumped into the economy. No, we don't. We need the opposite. We need the exact opposite of that. And what Mises' example also shows, and I know this is easy to take out of context and hostile people can interpret it the wrong way, but I'm speaking to people of goodwill, not hacks and propagandists, when I say that the recession period, the recession phase, as painful as it can be, is actually when we are restored to health. Because look at the master builder example. The recession period is when his error comes to light. And he says, wait a minute, I'm engaged in an unsustainable project here. I either have to go back and scale back my expectations or abandon this project and move into something else. That's a good thing. Because, in fact, the bad part was the boom. When he was allocating resources wrongly, when he was squandering them on projects the economy doesn't have the resources to finish, that was bad. That impoverishes us because a lot of these resources cannot be recovered. And so we're that much the poorer. So the recession is when we say, all right, wait a minute, we've done a lot of stupid things we shouldn't have done, and now we need to let the market price system sort out what's profitable, what's sound, what's a bubble project, what needs to be abandoned, and we'll just clean all this out and start again on a firm foundation. That's what the recession accomplishes. And it can be short and swift if the government doesn't interfere in it. Now, we've just lived through the classic example of what happens when you have an economic downturn and the authorities try to inflate their way out of it, create more money, pump it into the banking system, push interest rates down. Because remember the dot-com boom of the late 1990s where you had these insane companies where they had no customers, nobody barely knew what they were making, if anything, and yet people were thinking they were going to get rich investing in these companies. A crazy sort of boom that eventually went bust around 2000. Well, going into 2001, Alan Greenspan decided, I'm sick of this whole economic downturn thing. It's time to laugh again, to quote Homer Simpson. We need to pump money into this economy and get interest rates down, and that'll stimulate things again. Well, in fact, he did that. We had 11 rate cuts in 2001. And this is when he really started being called the maestro. Because, wow, this man, this mighty overlord before whom we're not worthy to stand, in whose presence we must wave incense, has somehow held off an economic collapse. Amazing. What an extraordinary man this is. Well, here's what the extraordinary man actually did. In 2001, we had the first recession on record we've ever had in which housing starts didn't decline. So that's because Greenspan wouldn't let the economy clear everything out. All the bad investments, stupid production decisions, clear them out. So instead, people drew the conclusion, wow, we've had a recession, and yet housing's still robust. So I guess that means housing never goes down, it's the best investment you can make, and all these myths get started because Greenspan, instead of saying to people, we've got to abandon a lot of what we've been doing, he says, oh, no, full steam ahead. Keep on doing what you've been doing. So now, the crash we have now is all the worse because in the interim, we've been persisting in these incorrect flows of spending and production. It's all the worse because instead of being corrected, we were affirmed. And so that is what Greenspan has done. And now recently, we had Greenspan, all tears and pity on television, saying to us that, this crisis just goes to show that there is a flaw in the free market that he had never noticed before. Now, of course, it means a lot when a guy like this people falsely believe is a free market guy because of his Ayn Rand days 40 years ago. He's still a free market guy today. And people say, well, hey, if even Greenspan says there's a flaw, who are you? You mere mortals, who are you to dispute what Greenspan says? Well, I would just simply say to Greenspan, not that he's listening, he's off making $150,000 a speech. Pretty good racket he's got going. But I would say to Alan Greenspan, we have found the flaw, and it is you. Now, without the Fed, how could you have a housing bubble? Now, a lot of people have tried to say these bubbles And by bubble, I just mean that prices that are unsustainably high. They can't possibly stay that high. And I realize this is a sensitive subject here in Las Vegas, but there's no getting around it, right? We have to talk about this. There are some people who say this is just a psychological phenomenon. You know, people just become insanely attached to a particular kind of investment or a particular asset class. And I don't mean to discount psychological explanations. I do think that once a bubble gets going, it feeds on itself. But I think the cause and effect and the order is sometimes mixed up, because if it had just been psychology, well, the market would have put a damper on that simply because where would you have gotten the credit to keep investing in housing? Because if there is unusual activity in some sector, prices go up. And if you had a free market in banking, interest rates would go up to say, hey, we're running out of stuff to lend. You don't actually need 3 houses. Maybe you should rethink this. But when you have a Soviet commissar running money and interest rates, you know, the big free marketeer is the Soviet commissar running money and interest rates, then he can create all this new money, pump it in, keep interest rates low, and keep this artificial phony thing going. So this was always Mises' argument, and even Anna Schwartz, who's not an Austrian but a Chicago school economist, said that anytime you have an asset bubble, there's always some kind of artificial credit inflating it. That's what does it. Because there's no way you'd be able to afford the constantly increasing prices unless there was some consistent spigot of credit being pumped into the economy. So it's not fair to blame HGTV for the housing bubble. I mean, that's, you know, it's a crazy simultaneous thing, and it may have played some minor role, but without the Fed pressing the accelerator, we wouldn't have had this problem. We should also point out that the issue of lowering lending standards is not altogether separable from the issue of the Fed. It's not just the Community Reinvestment Act. It's that if the Fed pumps money into the economy, into the banking system, well, under the incentive structure we have right now, the banks want to stay loaned up to the absolute legal extent possible. So if they get suddenly more money to lend out, and it's burning a hole in their pockets, who is going to be the recipients? Who will be the recipients of this money? If not people they would have rejected otherwise. Because, for example, the example I give in Meltdown is, let's suppose I've got a basketball team, and then as soon as I pick my players, I'm suddenly told, by the way, you get to pick 2 more. Well, logically, where am I going to pick those 2 more players from? From the pool of people I had just rejected. So naturally the standards are going to go down. That's unavoidable. And all through this, by the way, we had something that investors knew informally as the Greenspan put, which everyone understood to mean that Greenspan is not going to let things unravel. If things turn bad for major market actors, he'll intervene and bail you out. And this happened time and time again. So this is not some theory that I came up with. You can Google Greenspan put and find out all about this. And I talk about it in Meltdown. But again, I mean, where is the free market in this? I'd like to know. I mean, in what way could this be the free market? What in fact happens when you have a central bank, and particularly since 1971, what happens is it institutionalizes what we call moral hazard. Now, we all know moral hazard is the phenomenon in which people become riskier when they believe that any losses they make will be spread out among the public instead of borne by them individually. They get to keep the profits but spread out the losses. Well, the Fed institutionalizes this problem, because why should financial firms worry so much about their capital? Why should they worry so much about the types of investments they're making when they can get injections of fresh liquidity when they need them? So naturally, there is going to be more risk-taking, more recklessness than there would otherwise be. I don't see how this can be disputed. It is the nature of the system. And so if people say we need more regulation, you have got to be kidding me that that's the explanation. We didn't have enough regulation. You've got to be kidding me. The banking industry is probably the most heavily regulated in the whole country. And the regulators thought that the securitization model was working just fine. It was just peachy. So what is and now we're being told we need a systemic regulator, and that's going to be the Fed. The Fed creates the systemic risk in the first place. And now they're going to, I mean, this is like we're living in an Orwell novel combined with a Kafka novel. It's just unbelievable. I mean, you wake up as a giant bug and they throw you in jail. I mean, it's a bizarre situation we're facing. Now, I'll point out, by the way, that one objection to what I'm saying would be, yeah, you know, in the 19th century we had a lot of booms and busts. You can't blame that on Alan Greenspan. Well, okay, that's true. I can't blame that on a person who hadn't yet been born and an institution that didn't exist. But again, I talk about this in Meltdown. If you look at those cases in the 19th century, they're all caused by the same thing. So we've either got national banks enjoying special government monopoly privileges and or a banking system that is consistently bailed out when it gets into trouble, so therefore it can create more credit in the economy than there exist actual saved resources to back it. If you look at the 1870s, supposedly the time of the long depression, worst depression ever, well, actually, economic historians now don't even believe there was a long depression in the 1870s. They actually don't even believe this occurred now. The consensus now is that there was a recession in 1873, but that the 1870s, along with the 1880s, were among the most robust decades in American history, according to every criterion you can imagine. Economic historians were misled into thinking this must have been a depression simply because prices declined on average by about 3.8% per year, and we've all been told that declining prices is just like death, like the worst possible thing. Zombies are going to roam the earth or something if you have declining prices. That's actually how, I won't get into deflation here, I talk about that in the book too, but that's actually a way people become rich. And in the old days before the Fed, you used to be able to save by just accumulating precious metal coins. Back when precious metals circulated as money, they held their value or gained slightly in value when they circulated as money. And so how did people save for the future? They just simply saved coins. They didn't have to go into the stock market and become speculators. Whereas today, because of the Fed, which has lowered the value of the dollar by 95% since it was created, no one in his right mind would save by piling up green pieces of paper. You'd be wiped out. You'd be ruined. No one can do that. So instead, we all have to become speculators and go into the stock market or invest in, heaven knows what, or go into debt to buy a house because we're told that the house will keep up with inflation. And yet, you can get wiped out and ruined by this. And yet, we're told that this is all for the common man. The Fed is there to help the common man. You've got to be kidding me. This is unbelievable. Again, and it's just every time I hear the left talk about questioning authority, and here you have the most regressive institution imaginable that rewards the financial elite in society and discombobulates the financial planning of every normal person in the country. And you can say that that's not worth questioning, or you're a crank to question it. You're a crank not to question it at this point. So there is something wrong with the money. Our money can be created at will in any quantity with basically almost no resources expended. This money is pumped into the banking system, pushes the rates of interest down, and creates this boom and bust cycle. And then when the bust comes, the major players who get caught out in the bust then go crying. They're all tears and sadness. They all go crying to the central bank, the paper money producer, because they know that there is no physical constraint on how much money the paper money producer can create. So they go to the paper money producer and say, bail me out, and they usually get what they want. Now, it seems to me that this is not obviously the best conceivable system. Now, we're being told that what needs to be done is we need fiscal stimulus. Oh, boy, this one's rich. We need fiscal stimulus. We gotta spend about $800 billion and blow it on money-losing projects. How do I know they're money-losing projects? If they weren't, the private sector would already be engaged in them. And secondly, when the heck has Barney Frank ever directed money to something that made any sense whatsoever? So just sort of a priori, you know it's a money-losing project. And by the way, I don't excuse Republicans who will say that the problem with the stimulus was that we didn't blow the $800 billion on the right things. I mean, this is kind of, again, not the sharpest response you might make. But the fact is the government, of course, has no profit and loss mechanism, so it has no way of knowing if it's doing well, if it's doing destructively badly, if it's wasting resources, if it's adding value. It has no way of knowing. It has no feedback mechanism. And it gets its resources by seizing them from the population. Kind of uncivilized. So it has no way of knowing how it's doing. So these are all going to basically lose money. And this is going to make us rich. This is what we're told. It's going to make us rich. And now Krugman, Paul Krugman, he who shall not be named, Paul Krugman says we need more stimulus. So notice the problem is never that the first crazy idea was a crazy idea. It's that we haven't done enough of the crazy idea. It is never let's reverse course and try something else. No, 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 no. We need to do more and more and more. We need to do exactly what Japan did. We need to do exactly what they did all through the 90s, and they continue to do. And now they've just contracted, their economy has contracted on at an annualized rate of 15%, which you might expect to hear for Haiti or something, but that's Japan, after following the advice of these geniuses, who all try to claim that, oh, no, 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 they didn't follow our advice precisely. They were off by 0.3%. Look, they did everything that Keynesians wanted them to do, and this is what they have to show for it, is basically a big old zero. But in terms of fiscal stimulus, well, first, it diverts resources, right? I mean, because where are the resources coming for these projects? It takes them away from the private sector. Now, the sophisticated Keynesians will come back with, these resources are idle. They're not doing anything anyway. So it's okay if we yank them back into production. Well, yeah, that would be the case, perhaps, if you could devise stimulus packages that would make use only of precisely the resources that are currently idle. But of course they're not doing that. They're coming up with a whole bunch of totally arbitrary projects, all of which are going to involve diverting steel or diverting labor from places where they are currently employed. So this idle resource argument doesn't work on those grounds. Secondly, again, the argument from idle resources. We need to spend money, we need the government to borrow money and blow it to get all the resources we have that are idle back into productive activity. Well, they never ask the question, why are all these resources idle in the first place? Why do we have idle capacity in the first place? What's going on here? And the Austrian explanation would be that this is a remnant of the artificial boom, that we've had production in areas that can't be sustained. And so we don't want to stimulate these back into use, or at least not at current prices. We need to see what the market decides where they should be deployed right now. It's like, for example, a restaurant owner in Vancouver who, when the Olympics come, he thinks, hey, great, apparently everybody loves my food. He doesn't realize that the reason everybody's coming into his restaurant is, the Olympics are in town, and there are a lot of spectators and athletes coming in, and they all have the Olympic circles, rings on their T-shirts, and this guy isn't quite noticing this, so he thinks, suddenly everybody just loves my food. I knew this was bound to happen. So he builds a second location, and then the Olympics go away. And now his second location, all his waiters and waitresses are standing around, they're getting no tips, there's nobody in there. Well, should we want to stimulate his idle resources back into activity? No. Obviously, that would divert resources away from healthy areas of the economy where the market needs to be given a chance to redeploy them. It would be a total waste to do this. Stimulus packages are like drinking Red Bull instead of sleeping. Because if you've had Red Bull before, which I haven't, by the way, I'm just like this naturally. This is without Red Bull. But if you have Red Bull, you know that what it's actually doing, it doesn't actually... There is no perpetual motion machine. You drink Red Bull and you just keep going. No, it's that whatever part of your body is not totally exhausted, the Red Bull will totally exhaust. And then it's not like, hey, no crash is coming. Oh, that crash is coming. Well, likewise, the fiscal stimulus, in effect, it seeks out, like the parasite that it is, the profitable sliver of the economy and sucks resources out of it, and therefore exhausts the economy still further. Now, monetary stimulus, let's print up more money and blow it. Well, again, we've already seen why that just intensifies the problem. That just puts it off for a few more years and makes it more intense when it actually gets here. So what we need, in fact, is the opposite of this. And interestingly enough, in American history, we have an episode in which that's exactly what was done. And that's 1920 to 1921. Now, some of you have heard me talk about this over and over again. And I have a YouTube on this very topic. It's called Why You've Never Heard of the Great Depression of 1920. And it's got like 33,000 views. This amazes me that people at this point are so desperate to figure out what's going on. They'll sit in front of their computers and like watch TV for 45 minutes about the Great Depression of 1920. That's wonderful. People are listening. That's wonderful. Well, what happened in 1920? Well, we